Hey everyone, this is Baylor, and in this quick video, we're going to implement GraphQL Relay's Global Object ID specification, which is a mouthful to basically just say that we want to have all our objects in our system have a unique ID so that a user, regardless of how they get their information from our API, can request more information about that object. And so it's the coolest thing, and I'll show you real quick. So in our system, we have projects, and a project belongs to a user. And so we've set up our GraphQL. This is from last time, where we can ask for all our projects, and in turn we can also get our user. Now I made a modification here as it returns all the users and all the projects, regardless who logs in. But what we want to look at here is if we actually ran this, we might actually get back like object ID 4 for our project and object ID 4 for our user. And that doesn't do us any good because what we want to be able to get to a point is where I can say, if you have an ID, you can hand it back to the GraphQL server and it'll come back and tell you more information about that object. And so the problem, and this is a common thing you'll see in any type of API, and in REST what you would do is you'd make a request to something like /projects/4, and for here you do a /users/4. And you could totally do that here, but GraphQL Relay has this idea where you have a unique ID for your object types, and then that gives you an endpoint to just say, give me information about it. So it's a long-winded way to basically say, when we do this in our current modification to the server, we get back a unique string. So the unique string for projects and users are very different. There are some similarities here because of the way we're encoding these. But it basically, the system is capable of, so if I say, give me this ID, and what I want is to know more about it, so I say node ID with this ID, give me the ID, and when we're on a project, give me the title. Run that, and you can see we get back the title for this project. I can do the same thing here for our user. I pass this in, run it, and this time we're going to say, on a user, give me back the email. We run that, and you can see very minimal change here. We're actually able to get back our user information here. And so this is where we want to get to a point where regardless of how we obtain the information, we can come back to the system, hand it this unique ID, and get more information about an object. So let's get started and actually do this. So I'll put this in, we run it, we're working, and what we're going to do real quick is stop the Rails server. I'm going to go back to my previous branch, start back up, run it, and if I run this again, you can see we're getting back our integer IDs. So we're at a clean state, back where we were at the last video. If you haven't seen that already, I recommend going to watch it. It's an introduction to GraphQL and Ruby. And so let's actually implement this. It's super, super simple. And so what we're going to do is the first thing we want to step into is our project schema. This is where we define the global schema for our GraphQL server. And what we want to tell GraphQL is how do we obtain this unique ID from an object? And so GraphQL has given us this fantastic syntax for doing this. We're going to say we want the ID from an object. And this gives us three parameters. It gives us the object, the type, and our context. And what we want to do is we're just going to return back our GraphQL schema unique within type .encode. And here we're going to have two arguments that we pass it. We're going to tell it the type name, which is just the string version of that object type class, and we're going to give it the object.id. Now, I'm making an assumption here that your ID for all your objects is always ID. If it's not that way, then I would recommend adding a switch statement above where you say like when our type or case type, when we have a post, for instance, then we're going to call object.postID, also call object.id, something like that. And so it's pretty trivial, but that's how I would recommend getting around that if you can't just always trust that you can call .id. Or you could probably just create another method on your object that you just alias at, or delegate it. That's your choice. So what we're going to do now that we've told GraphQL, when you have an object, here's how you get the ID. We're just going to take this, and what it does behind the scenes is it takes this object type name, which is in our case going to be like project or user. It'll look like this, project with a capital P, and it's going to separate with a dash, and it's going to put the ID here, which in our case will be like 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And then when it takes that unique string, which is unique because the project has unique IDs compared to like user IDs, right? Because here we're specified with a type. Once it has that, what we can do is we're going to base 64 encode it. That's all it's going to do. Super simple, but it gets the job done. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to have to tell GraphQL, once you have this object ID, how do you get back our object type? How do you find the record that it belongs to? And so what we're going to do is just say object from ID. And in this case, we only need two things. We're going to get back the ID, and it's going to give us our current context making all these requests. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to have a way to get the type name and our object ID back. And that's equal to GraphQL schema unique within type dot decode, and we hand it in our ID. That's all we have to do. And because it understands how it's going to separate this based on a dash, it just decodes it, splits it out, and tells us what they are in separate variables here. And so what we're going to do is I'm just going to call type name dot constantize, and I can do that because I'm inside of Rails and that's part of active support. And I'm just going to trust that all my types are active record objects, so I'm just going to call dot find and give it that object ID. Object ID might be a bad name. I'll name it object ID like this, since that is actually a Ruby method. Shouldn't be too big of a deal, but we'll just go ahead and do that to be safe. And so this is everything that we need to do to actually tell GraphQL, once we have an object, how do we get an ID? Once we have an ID, how do we get an object? And so to make this change, it's super, super minor. We're just going to hop into our project type class. And where we've defined our field before is just a type integer, we're going to replace this with global field ID. Or global ID field. I always get that wrong. It's ID here. We're going to go to our user type, and we're going to make that same change here. And so now, if I refresh, we take a look at the documentation, we go into our project type, for instance, you can see that ID has been retyped as an ID. And when I run this, you can see that we're already getting back our unique ID here. Now, this only gets us kind of halfway to the solution because we haven't told GraphQL that we want to be able to reference any object from our system with a node and give it that ID. So let's do that next. I'm going to paste this in real quick because that's the first thing we're going to do. And we want to be able to call ID. And we're going to say that when we're on a project, give me back the title. And I'll go ahead and do this to fill it all the way. When we're on a user, give me back the email. So we run this. We get the field node doesn't exist on query type or type query. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. Super, super simple as well. We're going to just close these out a little bit. Go to our query type. And we're going to just specify that we have a new field. Call it node. And we're going to specify that we want GraphQL relay node.field. Now, I'm not going to run this yet because if you do it now, it'll crash the server because GraphQL wants to know a little bit more about what types we're allowed to go back and forth between, because this is going to understand that if we give it this unique ID here, this is going to be project, because that's where I pulled it from, with some like -1 or -2, whatever it turns out to be based off of these last few characters here. And so we don't want to be able to just get any object in our system and call .find. And so what we needed to do is go back to our project schema, and we need to tell it how to resolve types. And so this gives us an object, and what we're going to do is just say when our object is a project, then we want to return back types, project type. And when it is a user, then we're going to return back types, user type. Else, we want to raise an exception here, or an error, and just tell it's an unexpected object. That way we don't allow anything to be requested in our system. But this is everything that we need to do, and I run it now, and we get an error. Fragment on project can't be spread inside a node. Okay, let me back this out and just double check real quick. Error. But given 2, expected 1. Project schema line 13. Maybe this takes a context as well. No. Ooh. We might have to implement the interface. I'm trying to get away with the minimum, and I think I've missed it. So we need to hop into our project type real quick. And what we need to tell it is that we implement the GraphQL relay node interface. Perfect. Run it now. That's all we need to do. So let me, while I'm here, tell it to do this on our user type. Doing such a bad job typing right now. Perfect. Need to make that a big L. Perfect. Run it again. And we got an error. Oh, I took it away. No. No.field. Interface. Perfect. Brea, I apologize. So let's do this on project as well. Call title. And we're on a user. We'll call email. Run it. Perfect. We can go back and forth between these two object types. So I'll go back to the user ID and run it, and so we get Bob example. Now, if you've paid attention and you realize my IDs are so much shorter than they were before, I want to show you something super cool that we can do here. Since we're encoding these IDs based off this project type and ID, or I add this class type in the ID that we have, what we can also do is even go further and say, how do we get a very, very unique ID based on our current user? And so you can do this at a company or customer level. You can do it at a user level. It's your call. I'm actually going to do it on a user level because what I really like about, I'll show you first. Let's go ahead and get in the middle of it. So I'm going to make a commit and just say that we add global ID. And so the next thing we want to do is generate a new migration. And we're going to add our GraphQL or graph token to users. And we'll say graph token is a string. So let's open that up real quick. Add graph token to users. And you can see that it's going ahead and add in this. We're also going to add an index to this. And what I want to do is just go for each of our users. And we're going to assign that graph token. And what I'm going to do is just call secure random hex, and I'm going to give it like 8. It's a little bit high for what we were wanting to do, but it's perfect. And then I'm just going to change that column. And I guess I'll call add column real quick. Because what I want to do is specify null as false. So we can't do that to begin with because we haven't actually assigned any values. But at this point, we've assigned a value to all the users. We've made sure they're unique. We haven't done a good job checking with that here, but I'm trusting that these are going to be very unique. And then we're going to change that to not allow null values. And so now we can migrate our database. And we get an error because I haven't cleaned my database since I did this. So you're just going to have to trust that I ran that migration, and you're just going to have to ignore all the errors here. So if we take a look at our users, you can see that we get back a unique graph token for each of our users. So what we want to do is just embed that as a separator between our objects. So if we go into our project schema, where we actually define object ID from object and object from ID, we have access to the context here. And so what we're going to do is just specify our separator is, and I'm just going to make a string here, and I'm just going to call our context current user dot graph token. And we're going to paste that in here because we need to have the same separator for when we're decoding as when we're encoding. And that's everything that we need to do to make this work. And so now we'll need to take this away because we're going to get an error here because this isn't going to exist anymore. Oh, we got an error. Oh, it's got a pending migration. No. Okay, so we remove that file. No more pending migrations. Now we have a syntax error. I can't win. And I pasted it, so we got it twice. Perfect. So now we're getting back a unique ID that has the user's ID in it. And so if I run this inside of a private window and I log in, so before I was logged in as Bob, I'm going to log in as Leo. Log in. We'll make this exact same query here. Paste, run, and you can see now we get a different object ID back because we've encoded it with the user's token. Now, that's not perfectly secure because we can just grab this and say base64 decode, and we can actually see that token. But we're trusting that the tokens are unique between customers and they don't have any sensitive information other than what how you make this API request. And I think this is fantastic because it's such a simple way to get back a very unique ID. And even though you can see a pattern here between this E and this I and this M, it's still very different between our other user. We have a completely different token here. And so because we have a different token, it makes it very hard to guess what are the other object IDs in the system. And even if you did decode this and you said, okay, let me grab 2 or 3 or 4, the average user might not know this base64 encoded. And especially if you introduce your own encoding mechanism instead of just following the default base64. And so this is everything I want to talk about in this video. Because what we've done is we've figured out a way that we can get back information about an object based off of this ID. We figured out a way to encode the IDs so they're very different between user and user so that it makes it a little bit harder for them to just hop in and start asking for information that doesn't belong to them. And finally, I just want to say thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up and subscribe because I'm going to keep making these awesome videos. Have a good evening or afternoon or morning, wherever you are. Goodbye.